I felt like they didn't quite get the full experience this semester because of how much stuff we were going to do in the recording studio that couldn't be done because of lack of preparation. Everything happened so quickly with going to the online class. And as I've mentioned in the email, I'm working in Pro Tools. You all are going to work with whatever software you have. I noticed that most people have either Logic Pro, Pro Tools. There are a few people that had Cubase. There were some people that had Ableton. A couple of people had Reaper, and people had GarageBand. With all of those software, you should be able to do at least some of what we're doing. You'll be able to do everything, but I may route things a certain way, and you might not have, for example, I don't think GarageBand has buses. It doesn't have aux tracks, but you'll be able to learn how to set up a mix properly in that, just using the best you can with the technology you have. We live in a really great time where there is an amazing amount of technology that can do incredible stuff. When I started doing this, I started actually doing this stuff in high school. We had in one of the practice rooms, we had a 4-track TAC machine. We had a mini Moog. We had a Sonic 6, which was like a big suitcase Moog. And we had a spring reverb and a piano and a couple microphones. And I started playing around with that. And what was capable of being done for the amount of money you spent versus now, you can't even compare the two. You can create more in your phone than we could 30 years ago with $15,000, $20,000 worth of equipment. So, all right, a few more people are here. So I'm going to go to screen share. Yeah, actually, David, what I'm doing is I'm doing a simultaneous live stream on YouTube right now. I figured out how to do that. And actually, the audio will be much, much better. I tested it out with Ed this week because YouTube will be stereo, and this is only mono. And so I've got like a second microphone hooked up here that's going just for the YouTube stream, and this is the microphone for the Zoom stream. Yeah, so great. So let me share the screen here. Okay. A couple of things before we start. Something that's very important to me, and anybody who's taken classes with me has heard this till it makes them sick of hearing it, is that being organized is an essential component to the study. It's essential. And that means being organized not just inside of the session that you're working on, but being organized in how you have your computer arranged. So many of you are on tight budgets, so I don't expect you to be able to do some of the stuff that I can do or that I've got set up. But you're looking at my desktop right now, okay? I've got my Macintosh hard drive here. This has all my applications in it that I use, right? Then if you look over here, I have a project drive. This is all of my Pro Tools projects, and every project I do runs on this SSD drive, external drive that I've got in a drive bay that has 4 external drives. So my application runs in here, but all my projects run on this external drive. Then you'll notice that I've got 1, 2, 3 drives filled with filled with my sample libraries. And then I've got additional drives. This is another sample library, but this is for stuff I don't use very often. And I also put my iMovie libraries in here to get them out of my hard drive, my main hard drive. And then I've got 2 backup drives. I've got my project drive 2, and I've just got a general backup drive. So I've organized, let's look at my project drive for a second. So this is my folder for my 2017 album called The Road Home. If I open this up, you'll see that I've got all my compositions for the album as I was working on them. Okay? And then if I open this up, you'll see this is my Pro Tools session folder. And inside the session folder are these guys here, these .ptx files. They're the session files. And notice I've kept a diary. I've got version 2, version 3, version 4, and then once I was finished, oh, and then I've got here, I've got all my artwork because I create all my artwork. So everything is in its own folder. That's a little sloppy, the artwork folder, but if I look in the master folder, these are my mix preparations for the album. You see that they're all in order. And then I engineered and wrote all the music and arranged it, and I did some of the mixing, and then I sent the final mix over to my friend Ken, and notice that he's got his initials on this folder as well. So what I did is I uploaded this entire folder with everything in it to Dropbox, and he downloaded it, and then we just passed these little session files back and forth, and you could see that we've got all these different versions so that I can go back if we work on something and we change something, and I say to my friend, you know, I liked the mix 2 days ago better. We have it. We're keeping a running diary. So organization is really key. Another thing that's really key in this study is having your data backed up in multiple places. So this is my current project drive. Down in my basement, I've got a drive that's not hooked up to my computer where I've got every project I've worked on for the past 15 years. It's in a huge, like a 4 terabyte drive. And additionally, I have that same drive with everything I did up until about January at my sister's house, not even in my house, so that if my house burns down, my intellectual property is still here. Let me just see if I have to, hold on one second. Okay, let me admit all these people. Is there a way, does anybody know if there's a way to admit people? I guess I have to have the chat window open when I'm screen sharing, because I've been doing Google Meet and not Zoom, so I'm not as familiar with Zoom as I am with Google Meet. So let me do this. So where would that, okay, so all right, I'm going to have to look for that, all right? Because right now, show chat. All right, I'll be able to do it this way, I believe. I hope, anyway. Okay. So the other two things that I want to talk about is organization and having a consistent method of naming your projects. Now, in my classes, I require all the students to label their projects like this. Let me make the text a little bigger. This is 6, and with your initials. This is how I require everybody to name their projects so that it's consistent. Once you get out of my class, you can do whatever you want. But whatever you do, you should have a consistent way of naming your projects, right? When you set up your, there's two aspects of this work. There's the aspect of this work where you are in a creative flow and you're working, whether you're writing, composing, whether you're mixing, whether you're recording a part. Learning how to get things set up technically to enable that flow is very important. Okay? And that brings me to the second point that dovetails in with the first point. Having consistent naming methods so that you can always find things, you know where things are on your hard drive and you find them. Being prepared, right? Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. That's something that I live by, and it's very important with this study, right? If you haven't learned how to do certain things to the point where you can play the computer like an instrument, it gets in the way of your flow. If you're trying to solo over a blues change in key of F and you don't know the F blues scale, you're going to have a lot of problems. If you don't know the 3 basic chords of the blues, forget about the substitutions, but if you don't know the 3 basic chords of the blues, you're going to have problems. You prepare and get all these things set up in advance. So, with that being said, one of the things that we should understand is signal flow. And understanding signal flow is essential to working inside of a DAW. And one of the ways that I like to describe signal flow is to show it like this: a guitar, electric guitar. It's very simple. Everybody's seen an electric guitar. Everybody knows that there's a cable that goes out of a guitar and goes into its amplifier, and sound comes out of the speakers. So if we think of our guitar as the source, what happens is that you pluck the string, and the string's vibration is turned into electrical energy by the pickup. And these things right here are the pickups. These are magnets with metal wire wrapped around them. And they could be Alnico magnets or they could be ceramic magnets, but they're magnets. And they're like microphones. You could actually talk into them and they will reproduce your voice. Jimi Hendrix did that to great effect at times. So the pickup is something called a transducer. A transducer is something that converts one type of energy to another. So what it's doing is it's taking these vibrations and it's changing it into a very weak electrical energy signal. And that signal is coming out of this jack here, and you have a patch cable right here, and it's routed to the input of this amplifier. This amplifier is made up of several stages. There's the preamplifier, then there's the tone stack, then you have reverb and tremolo in this amp, and then there's the power section, and then there's speakers. So an amplifier does what the name implies. It amplifies or increases the amplitude, which is the volume, of an electrical signal from the guitar. This is then routed to the speaker. A speaker is another type of transducer that changes electrical signal back into audible energy through vibrations of the speaker cone. So if you were to look at your speakers on your stereo, most people don't have stereos now. They've got earbuds and tiny little things. But when I was growing up, you would have these speakers that were in these big rectangular wooden cases. And you could take the grill off and you could actually see the cone of the speaker vibrating, right? That is producing the sound that you're hearing. And a speaker is also a microphone. You can wire a speaker in reverse and use it as a microphone. Okay, so speakers and pickups and microphones are very, very interrelated. So the signal flow here is guitar, cable, amplifier. Very simple. The next thing I want to show you is to have signal flow with inserts. So we have guitar, our source, signal modifiers, and amplifier. The signal modifiers, they're inserted into the signal path. And what do? They do several things. They can either be corrective in nature or they can be transformational in nature. corrective, transformational, and sometimes something that's corrective is transformational, and sometimes something that's transformational is also corrective. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. So let's look at this for a minute. We've got our original guitar source, and our patch cable comes, and it goes to the input of a wah-wah pedal, which is an envelope follower, right? It does a filter sweep across the frequencies, which changes the signal. You could then route that into an overdrive pedal, which modifies the sound. That gets the output of the overdrive pedal to the input of a delay pedal. You can have echo, the output of the echo into a reverb box, and the output of the reverb box into the speakers. So basically, you are taking your signal path, which is guitar, patch cable, amplifier, and you are inserting all of these devices into the signal path to change the sound. And one other item here that I'd like to talk about is that this is going from left to right, which is how a guitar signal goes, because most guitarists are right-handed, so the jack is on the right-hand side of the guitar, and that means the input for your pedal should be on the right-hand side, so that you're not crossing over the cable in front of you before it goes into the pedal. That's the opposite of how a DAW works, so just keep that in mind. So down here, I've got the DAW equivalent of this, and a DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation. That's Pro Tools is a DAW, Logic is a DAW, Reaper, Cubase, Ableton, GarageBand, all DAWs. You have your source, which is the audiophile / software virtual instrument, like Contact, or for those of you that have Logic, you might have your ESX sampler. Those of you that have Pro Tools, you would have Mini Grand. Then your plug-in inserts, EQ and compression mostly. That's the equivalent of these guys here. And then that gets routed to the master bus, which goes out to your speakers. All right, so the basic thing here is that the signal path goes from guitar to amplifier, and when you're doing something called an insert, you are interrupting that signal path with a device that will modify or transform the sound. So for this first project that we're going to be doing together, let me just go back and see if there's anybody else waiting. Any questions on that so far?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, and who's this? Oh, Brian? Ryan?
Yes. Does the order of the inserts matter?
That's a very good question. And what I would say to you is that the order of the inserts, yes, it does matter. And it matters in that it affects the end sound. It doesn't matter. And there are, with a guitar, there are electronic considerations. So, for example, a wah-wah pedal doesn't like being, I forget whether it's in front of or in back of a fuzz pedal. There's something about the combination of those two electronic devices where there's only one way to do it. But if you want to put a delay pedal before an overdrive, you will get one sound. If you like that sound, that's the sound that you're going for. If you put the delay pedal after the overdrive, that's a different sound, right? So some people like to put EQ before compression, and that is what I teach, but there are times when you have EQ after compression. So it does matter, but mostly it matters because of the result you want. Does that make sense? Okie doke. And yep, Mark.
Yes. Do you have any opinion about using like iCloud Drive or storage sites like Google Drive in coordination with DAWs, like as opposed to running your sessions from your iCloud Drive directly into Logic, for example, in addition to backing stuff up on external drives?
I've never done that. I don't know how well that would work. How fast is your internet connection? Right? The fastest way is an SSD drive with a Thunderbolt 3, or if you've got a computer that's got a PCI slot and it's you've got a card that's an SSD that's plugged into a card that's right onto the computer's motherboard. That's the fastest way. Can you run a session off the cloud? I guess you could. I've never done it. That's not something that I actually know, but it's not something I would ever do. If I've got, if I've got 100 instruments open on a film score, how do I manage that when streaming all that stuff off the cloud? That gets to be really difficult. Storing your stuff in the cloud as a backup is a good deal. And I also have, I pay for a Dropbox, which is 2 terabytes, I think, and I've got stuff back up there as well. Okay, so everybody seems we have 60. Okay, I'll come back and check this in a few minutes. So let me go back to sharing the screen. So we're going to use 3 types of tracks, all right? Now, if your DAW does not have any of these tracks, just do the best you can. All right. So the first track that we're going to be using is an audio track. An audio track contains audio information. In modern DAWs, this info is digital. It's a series of ones and zeros, and it's a series of samples. And I'm not going to get into talking about digital audio theory here. There, you could in this session, if you want me to, I can, but we're just gonna. That would get us really sidetracked here. I mean, I could talk about how, a second, 48,000 samples per second, and that gives you with the Nyquist theorem a frequency response of 24-bit and of 24K, and I could also talk about how bit depth and all that. I have a bunch of materials to show about that, and maybe in the future I'll get into that, but let's just talk about getting practical stuff done. So audio track. This track can be either mono or stereo. So mono is 1 channel, meaning it was recorded with 1 mic, or stereo is 2 channels, meaning it was recorded with 2 mics, and you have a left and a right channel. The second track that we're going to be working with are aux tracks, or auxiliary tracks. An aux track is a channel or track in a DAW that functions similarly to an aux input on a mixer. It is a bus destination for routing signals. Audio that gets sent to the aux track does not get recorded. It passes through the channel. It does not get recorded. You cannot have audio on an aux track. You can only have audio passing through an aux track, sent or bussed from somewhere else. An aux track is useful for adding time-based effects like reverb and delay to multiple audio tracks. And they are also useful for routing the outputs of a series of related tracks, like a drum kit where there are separate audio tracks for kick, snare, hi-hats, overhead, etc., to give the mixer, the person who's mixing, more control over the output of the group. Okay? So the big difference between an aux track and an audio track is that the audio track has an audio file that it plays. An aux track cannot play an audio file. An aux track has audio passed through it from somewhere else. So you would take one of your audio tracks and you would send a copy of audio from that track using a send or a bus to the input of an aux track. Then that copy of that audio from your original audio track would go through the aux track, and in the insert of the aux track you could have a reverb, and that's how you would add reverb to a track. This sounds complex, but I will, as this goes on, I will show you all this stuff and it won't be that difficult. So just stay with me. The last track is a VCA master track. Now, I've only been using VCAs for about 5 or 6 years, but now that I'm using them, I have a hard time mixing without them. So a VCA, or a voltage controlled amplifier. Now, remember that we're working in a digital world, and Pro Tools is set up to create a digital version of the 24-track studio paradigm, which you have a 24-track tape machine that plays all your audio tracks, and it comes through a mixing console. After the mixing console, it goes out through the speakers that you monitor through. So all of those things that are found in the mixing area of a 24-track studio, when they made Pro Tools, they decided to go down that paradigm because they wanted to entice engineers to change. And the one thing that they thought was, we don't want to make this so different from what they're used to that they don't want to bother with it. Because who has time to learn new software? It was a big, and back then in the 1990s, it was a big enough jump to learn how to use a computer. And then on top of that, to learn a whole new way of working. They thought that that would be too much to ask. So they made it to be analogous to the analog experience of a 24-track machine. Okay. A voltage-controlled amplifier track provides a means of easily controlling a group of faders, allowing the overall level or overall volume of the grouped tracks to be brought up or down whilst maintaining the relative balance of the group members and maintaining the individual track automation. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you've got a drum set that has a stereo track for overhead, and a track for the kick drum, and a track for the snare drum. You've got those grouped together, and you've got that group assigned to a VCA. So in your mix, you've got the overheads set to -2 dB. You've got the kick drum set to -5 dB, and the snare drum set to -5 dB as well. The whole track is a little bit too loud. So you bring your VCA master down 5 dB, and every one of those tracks will also come down 5 dB. All right? So a VCA, the other function that a VCA does, which is really good for musicians, which is what we all are. I'm not an audio engineer. I'm a composer and a pianist, right? We think in terms of music. So when I look at my session, part of me wants to look at it like I'm looking at a score. So if you're looking at an orchestral score, between the woodwinds and the brass, there's a little space. Between the brass and the percussion, there's a little space in the system, right? A VCA master track visually emulates that a little bit. So it really helps me with visualizing where things are inside of my session. All right, so this is your basic DAW signal flow. You've got your audio track, and this is your waveform for your audio track. That audio track goes to the input of the audio channel. It goes through this channel strip, which has a set of inserts and a set of sends, has panning, which is this here, and then it has an output down here, has a fader right here, which adjusts the level. This output of this goes to the input of the master bus. and the output of the master bus goes to your speakers. So it's very simple. Audio through the channel, from the channel through the master bus. And notice we're going from left to right this time. Signal flow from multiple tracks. So imagine each one of these tracks has its own audio track, right? Every one of these audio tracks goes through the input of each of these audio channels, goes through all of the inserts, the sends, the fader, and each one of these outputs all enters the master bus, and the output from all of the source tracks, these are source tracks, is routed through the master bus or the main end to the main outputs of the DAW. And every one of these signals that gets into this master bus, all of those levels, the volumes, are all added together. That's called summing. So if you ever hear the term summing, it's the output levels of all the tracks added together. That's a simple way of thinking about it. And this stuff is really important because if you read that PDF on gain staging that I sent you, you start to understand how the volume of the source track is important, the output of all these tracks are important, and how they feed into the master bus is important. The levels of all these tracks are important in order to get the optimal sound out of your session. And we'll be going over that stuff. Now, the next thing here is your basic DAW audio signal flow with sends and aux tracks. So we have our audio track and we have our audio channel. So the audio is going through here, out, and into the master bus. I want to add some reverb to that track. So in this send area here, I insert a bus. And I've got that routed to the input of this aux track. So this little send also has a little mini fader when you click on it, and you can adjust the level of audio that you are sending to the aux track. So a copy of the audio sent or bussed to an aux track using this send, right? And then this is usually for reverb and delay, this method. It can also be used for compression, but that's a little bit more advanced. Then the output of this aux track also gets fed into the master bus where all these signals get mixed together for the output. So this is a little trickier than the simple DAW signal flow. But this type of stuff, routing audio like this and understanding the flow from this send to the aux track to modify the sound, to transform the sound, to enhance the sound. These are the kinds of things that help to make your mix sound more professional. And we'll be getting into that. All right. All right, any questions on that so far? That's a lot of stuff, but you have all those diagrams I made for you. You can review all that stuff. And this is stuff that you can find online if it's confusing. So, yeah. Go ahead, Arun. Yep, go ahead, Arun. Yeah, so There's a couple of methods, and this is one thing I don't like. Logic is a fantastic program. One thing I don't like about Logic is that they make a lot of decisions for you. So if you call up a sound, it'll come with a complete signal chain in it, right? How are you supposed to learn how to create the sound when they do all the work for you? That's the first thing. So then everybody gets set with the idea of inserting reverb into the track. So you've got 50 tracks. You've got 50 different kinds of reverb on each track. How is that going to make a whole that sounds like it's recorded in the same room? Correct. Now, that being said, I often mix with several reverbs, but they all have a different function. So let's say, for example, I'm mixing an orchestral score, and it's all done with my orchestral samples. I'll have maybe 3 reverbs. I'll have a large hall, and then maybe I'll have a hall that's not quite so large and a smaller hall. And the things that I want to sound like they're in the front of the stage, I might put through the smaller hall. Things I want to sound like they're in the back of the stage, I might put them in the larger hall. Right? That's just one possibility. There are many possibilities. But the send to reverb and delay came into, again, based upon the 24-track paradigm. Most recording studios would have a few reverbs, a few digital reverbs, or maybe they would have a plate, or maybe they would have a chamber, right? And I will get into what a chamber is and what a plate is and all that stuff as we go along with this. And they would send their audio signals through these different devices. They didn't have 15 chambers, one for each instrument. They didn't have 20 plate reverbs, one for each instrument. They had one chamber. Maybe they had 1 or 2 plate reverbs, and starting in the 80s, they had some digital reverbs like a PCM 60 or a PCM 70 by Lexicon, or a 224 or a 480, right? Or they would have an EMT reverb, like all these digital reverbs. They were really expensive. So basically, that's how that practice started, and that's what we're used to listening to. And that's how you can get a really nice, mix that fits together. Correct. Each one on its own aux track. That being said, you can create an effects chain on an aux track where you've got reverb, digital delay, or delay, and then maybe a second reverb, and you're creating, maybe you have a pitch shift, right? So that part of that signal is getting shifted up an octave. So you're creating a much like sticking a bunch of guitar pedals together to create a sound. You're creating like a sound design. So yes, you can create a chain of effects, and I like doing that too for ambient music, for sure. Yes, and this is Paul. How are you, Paul? You could use the sends. You can automate the volume of the sends. Aux tracks are also used to route the outputs of several instruments together. So in other words, remember I talked about the drum kit, right? If I wanted to apply overall compression and EQ to the entire drum kit, I would route all those outputs to an aux track. So we're going to do all these things on this first mix, step by step. So good. These are all good questions. Definitely ask questions. And also, I just want to talk about the way this is going to work. So we have over 60 people here now. And so we're going to work this like a workshop. We're going to go over something, and you guys are going to mix something, the same piece. And I'm just going to show you more and more stuff for a few weeks, then we'll go on to another project. But come in with questions. If you've got questions when you're working and you don't understand why something's not happening, or you come across a problem, or you want to learn a little bit something more about a specific aspect, come in with questions. I'm not going to be marking and going over 60 projects a week. That's a little bit much. But I definitely want to ask questions, and this will work out really well, I think. All right, so let's move on. So in that folder, I have here, I sent you something called UKS M3 stems, right? I have the tempo of this piece here. So it's 151 beats per minute. And if you look in here, we have all these files. These are WAV files. And that's the audio file format that's most currently used right now. That's most often used right now. There are other audio file formats, AIFF. There used to be Sound Designer, which is not used that much anymore. But this is the main one that's used. This is certainly used in all film and television work, WAV, and that's what I work in. And if you notice here, they're one of two sizes. They're either all 25.4 megabytes or they're 50.7 megabytes. Can anybody think why a couple of these are bigger and the rest are all the same? Correct. Notice it's twice the size. Very good. So it should be just the piano. Yep, the piano and the overhead drums. And notice the way that these are all labeled, right? You know exactly what these instruments are. One thing I find that you have to be pay attention to when you're working is that you name your track before you start recording something. Otherwise, you will have something called audio with clips and everything like that. And that really becomes a mess and disorganized. So I've got all of these things here. And I'm going to now open up Pro Tools, which is already open. And I'm going to create a new session. And I'm going to title this UKS M3 Mix 6-20 61-20, my initials. Whoops. Now, the reason I use underscores and everything like that, it's an old convention because older computers would sometimes not see the space. And also, if you're making sample libraries, having the underscore helps the sample software to map the samples to the appropriate place. And I'm going to use my sample rate. I think these are 44.1. Although almost all film and television, well, all film and television is done in 48K, but this is from 2004 this piece is from, and it's a cue from a film I scored called Unknown Soldier. It was a feature film that did very well in the independent film circuit, and then it was on Stars probably like 8 to 10 times a month for 3 or 4 years. So it did very well. But let's open up this session. And right now, I'm going to save this on my desktop. Typically, I would save it in my project drive. But most of you guys probably don't have external drives right yet. So for you to work on your laptops, on your desktops is okay. It's not the greatest thing, but I'm going to do something that you would probably do. So I'm going to save that on my desktop. Great. And then I'm going to change my tempo to 151. And then I'm going to import my audio. Right? And there's a key command for this. Command-Shift-I. And then I'm going to navigate to my desktop. Oops, not there. And I'm going to select all of these. And this is very important, and I don't know how this works on Logic and the other softwares. But you want to make sure that all of your material for your project is in one container, in one folder with various subfolders. So this is very important. This is really important. And I can't tell you how often students mess this up, and it takes them a few times to get this. It's very tempting to just click on add because it's blue and it's very inviting. Blue is very inviting. It's much more inviting than red. But anyway, you don't want to do that. You want to copy or copy all, or sometimes this says convert. You want to copy all of these audio files into your session, and then Pro Tools will put them in an audio files folder that is inside the session folder. And I'll show you that in a second. So I've copied these, and I'm going to do done. And then I'm going to choose the audio file destination folder. And then I'm going to add new track. These are all going to be new track at the beginning of the session. Okay, great. Now, let me just hide this window for a second. So this is my session folder. If I click on this, it's got all these other folders in there. If we notice here, all of my audio files have been copied here. So why is that important? Why can't I just work on them from this folder here? Anybody know? Anybody who's taken a class with me know the answer to that? Oh, hi, Dimitri. Why is it important to have the audio files in this folder inside your session folder? Right, so that let's say you're collaborating with somebody else. You would send them, you would upload a compressed version of this file, of this folder, and it would have all the assets Pro Tools needs to work inside of it. If you have not copied these audio files, the audio files folder will be blank. So they will open this up on their computers and they won't have the audio files. It won't play back. Okay? So it's like having a book with no pages in it. Okay. Before we go on, I want to do something here. I'm doing this so that because of the way I've had to set this up, so I can get the YouTube audio happening. I've got something called Soundflower that's running to OBS, so I need to do this in advance, and I'll go over this in a second. Okay. Now, before we do anything, we have to do a little organizing. So we're going to organize in several ways. We're going to organize by instrument type and by color. And if I'm doing an orchestral score, I typically like to set it up like I would see an orchestra. I've got my winds on top. I've got my brass, I've got percussion, and then I've got strings. The only thing I do differently is in orchestral music, the French horn is usually on the line of the top line of the brass, and I like to see things by pitch, so my trumpets are on the top line of the brass. But for this kind of a piece, I'm going to have my drums at the top. So I'm just going to drag my drums here. So I've got an overhead, a kick drum, and a snare drum. I've got 3 tracks of drums. And let me color code them. So I'm going to select all 3. So I click on the top one, then click on the bottom one, and then I click on the color palette, and I'll just color code all those like that. So these are things that you have to learn how to do in your own DAW, how to color code. If you don't know how to do that, just do a Google search on YouTube, or just do a YouTube search. There's millions of videos that'll show you how to color code your tracks. So anybody venture to say what I would have next to the drums? What instrument in a small jazz ensemble? Correct. And notice here we've got 1, 2, 3 bass tracks. So we're just going to drag these up here like this. And then I'll color code these. And I'm just going to go down the palette. And then I'll put the piano after that. And then I've got bari sax, bass clarinet, tenor sax solo, and 3 trumpets. So I'm going to take the trumpets and put them up on the top of the brass. And then I'll take my tenor sax. Then I've got tenor sax solo, bari sax, and bass clarinet. Okay. So let me play this back, and we'll take a quick listen and see what we got. Oh, we don't need to have the click track playing. You can all hear that? All right, you get the general idea of the track. So right away I could tell that the piano's too loud. I could tell a bunch of things just from listening to it. It's very dry. The brass, I can't hear the brass loud enough. But before we start getting into mixing that, I just wanted you to get a sense of how everything sounded. We still have more organizing to do. All right, I want to color code my piano. And I'm going to color code all my brass. So I'm just going to click on the top one, hold the shift key down, go to the bottom one, and I'll pick another color. I don't like that color. And I don't like the color of the piano. It's nice to have things look nice. And you can resize this so you could see everything in the window as well. And you should learn those kinds of shortcuts, how to resize things. So in Pro Tools, you hold the Option and Control key and then click the up and down arrows to resize things. To fit everything in the window, you hold the Control and Option key down, hit A. If you have an area selected and you want to fit it in the window, Control Option F. So, and then in Pro Tools, we do this thing called we turn on key focus, which is this over here, A and Z on the upper right hand side. And then I can use the T key to zoom in and the R key to zoom out. So key commands are also very important things to learn. So this is all now organized by color. And I want to create something called groups. So I do that by highlighting the tracks I want to group. So I hold the shift key down, I click on the drums, the name, and then I go to snare. So these are my 3 drum tracks. I want to create a group called drums. So in Pro Tools, it's Command G to open up the groups command or function. And I'm just going to call this drums. I've got 3 bass tracks, and I'll talk about why there's 3 bass tracks in a second. It's Kermit Driscoll playing bass. And my brass. Okay, so now I've got groups. And you have to see where this is on your DAW. But all DAWs have these things called lists. So on the left-hand side of Pro Tools, you have two lists. You have your tracks list, which is up here. These are all your tracks that are in the session. And you've got your groups list, which is over here. So we've created 3 groups. So if I highlight and turn on the drums group, notice they get highlighted. And notice that if I change the size of one of them, all of them change. If I solo one, all of them solo. If I mute one, all of them mute. So it's a quick way of doing the similar functions to all of those tracks. But what I want to do here is I want to create my VCA masters. So I'm going to click on the lowest part of the drum kit, Command-Shift-N in Pro Tools, and I'm going to create one VCA master, and I'm going to call this Drums VCA. Excuse me. And then over here, you have to assign this to a group, drums. And what I like to do with my VCAs is I like to have them be no color at all. So I will turn the color off here. So how this would translate out to you guys that are not using Pro Tools is all your VCAs, all your aux tracks should be one color, right? All your instruments within each group of instruments should be the same color. All your VCA tracks should be one color, and all your aux tracks should be a different color. Another color, but all of those should be the same color as well. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the bass. Command-Shift-N. Yes, sir.
I have an older version of Pro Tools, and the only options I have for creating a new track are audio, aux input, master fader, MIDI track.
Right. So you won't be doing the VCA. I have another student who has that. You will be doing the aux tracks instead. Right? So you just do as much as you can with what you've got. You'll still be able to get stuff done. So this is bass VCA. And then I have to assign that and turn the color off. And VCAs are not stereo or mono, they're just VCAs, right? They only control the levels of faders. There's no audio that goes through them. And I know that there's woodwinds in here, but I'm going to call it brass VCA. So let's solo our, we can now click this and we can hear just our drums. Right? If I want to hear just the drums and the bass, I can also solo the bass. And notice how between our drums and our bass, we've got a little space, like a score, right? We're musicians, we're not engineers. So I have trained engineer friends that I've learned an incredible amount from. They think in terms that my head would explode. It's tough enough to think about things in musical terms. So I try to transfer all that stuff into things that I can understand on a musical level. And I'll be showing you that as we go along with this study. And that's how I teach all of this stuff as well. All right, and the very last one is to have the brass VCA and set that up. Great. And when you've done, save often. Save now and save often. Okay. So for those of you that don't have aux tracks or VCAs, what I would say that you can do for next week is to get all of your tracks input into whatever DAW you're using, get them organized, and get them color-coded. That'd be a good start. And then I'm going to go one step further now. And after the brass VCA, I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to do Command Shift N, and I'm going to add more than I need because I can always delete them. I'm going to add 6 stereo AUX inputs, and I'm not going to name them. So, what? Yeah. Because you're going to be sending, they can be either one, but we're sending stereo audio through them. Even though, so for example, the drums, there's a stereo track here. You can see that there's 2 for the overheads, and a mono kick drum and a mono snare drum. So the way this was recorded was that there were 2 microphones about 4 feet above the drums facing down towards the tom-toms. Like actually facing towards the center of the snare drum, right? There's stereo left and right. Then there was a drum, there was a mic above the snare drum and a mic right outside the kick drum. So there were 4 microphones. The overheads were recorded as stereo, and then you've got 2 mono tracks. And I'm going to talk about how to deal with that as we go along with this. Now, even though the bass is mono, I'm just making them all stereo with a pan down the middle. But all of these brass tracks are mono, but we're going to pan them left and right, which makes them effectively a stereo, the aggregate of all of them together, a stereo track. Right? The aggregate of those 5 or 6 brass tracks, when you've got them panned left to right, even though each individual track is mono, what comes out is a stereo field. Because you've got some on the left, some a little bit more to the center, one in the center, one on the right, one all the way to the right. So that makes a stereo spread. And yes, you can have a mono AUX track, yes. But I generally use stereo AUX tracks for everything. No. Questions are good. If I had a big band here with 5 trumpets and 5 saxophones and 4 trombones, and I might do it in 2 groups, in 4 groups. I might do a trumpet, saxophone, trombones. I might do 3 groups, and then I might do 1 group that's all the brass together. But right here we've got a small ensemble. Right? We've only got really, I mean, there's 3 trumpet tracks, but they're only playing one at a time. There's 2 tenor tracks, but there's only one of them playing at any time. So it really is like 4 horns, even though there's all these tracks. So it's a small ensemble. All right. Okay. So what I want to do with my first 3 AUX tracks is I want to route. Let me just see if there's anybody else waiting in the. Okay.
I have a question while we're.
Yes. Go ahead. Yes.
What's the difference between a VCA and a bus?
A VCA only controls the level of faders, right? So let me just show you something here. This is the virtual mixing board in Pro Tools. This is our drums VCA, right? Right here. Watch what happens to these 3 faders here when I move this up and down. You see that they're moving in parallel? Now, if I have these set up like this, see, they all move simultaneously. There's no audio going through the VCA. None at all. They're only controlling the levels, the audio level, the levels of these faders. Ascend is controlling the amount of audio that's being bussed to another track, which is typically an AUX track. It's controlling the amount of audio that's being sent to another track. So in other words, and I'll get to that in a second, but if I use the send here, oh, here we go. And I send it to bus 3 and 4. If I turn this up, it's turning up the level of audio that's being sent from the copy. It's turning up the level of the copy of the audio that's being sent from this track to the destination. So audio is flowing through here. With the VCA, typically in an analog world, it's only changing the voltage, which is changing the level of these faders. So no audio goes through a VCA track. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so would you typically want kind of a bus for each VCA?
It's project dependent, but on this track, yes, we're going to have that. So we're going to have 3 aux tracks. We're going to have our drums. And you can name this either drums sub or drums master. I'm just going to name it drums master. And the next one will be bass master. And again, I'm streaming this live on YouTube, and hopefully it's working all well at the same time. So you'll be able to, I'll send a link for that. You'll be able to review this. And then the next one will be brass master. And then the next thing, 2 other things I need to do. I need to do something called solo safe for these. What does that mean? That means I'm going to disengage the solo button. That means any audio that comes through this thing will be playing. So that if I solo the drums up here, I'm going to route the output of these drums through this aux track. And if I solo them, I want the sound to continue. So I'm going to disengage all these aux tracks by holding, in Pro Tools, I'll hold down the Command key and click on the S, and that, you see how they become grayed out? That means that you can't, the solo function doesn't work on those tracks, and audio will always go through there. So now I need to assign inputs. So I want my drums and my bass and my brass. I'm going to take the input and I'm going to assign them to 3 contiguous inputs. Let me do that one more time. There's a key command to do that in Pro Tools, right? And I'm messing that up, sorry. Okay, so notice how this one is bus 3, 4, bus 5, 6, and bus 7, 8. And I'm going to rename these. So you should learn how to rename these buses, in your DAW. In Pro Tools, you right click on them and you can rename this. So I can call this drums. Okay, and then the next one is bass. Now, I'm going to make a comment here for a second. We're doing a lot of stuff that seems like busy work. If I'm going to work, if I'm going to cut down a tree, I'm going to make sure that my axe is sharp. I'm going to spend time sharpening that axe before I start to cut down that tree. If I've got a dull axe, it's going to be virtually impossible if it's a big tree to cut it down. A sharp axe makes it a lot easier. So I spend time sharpening that axe. If I'm going to repair a car, I make sure that all my tools are clean. All my tools are where I can find them, right? Everything's organized in order, and it makes the process of doing the job much easier. So all this preparation work, once you learn how to do it, it's very quick. It seems busy and slow and pedantic right now, But once you learn how to do this and do it a bunch of times, it becomes second nature and it becomes quick. It doesn't take very long at all. And eventually you can even set up templates that you can plug things into that have some of these things already pre-routed for you. And then you can save a lot of time as well. All right, so now it's time to assign my outputs of my drums. So I select these three drums, my three bass tracks, and my brass. They all go to. Now, in Pro Tools, to assign the output of many, like of all these selected tracks to the same place, there's a key command. It's Option and Shift. So in other words, if I have all these tracks selected, I hold down Option and Shift, and I select the output to be 15 and 16, they all become 15 and 16. If I select the output to be brass, they all become brass. To make them contiguous, so that one would be 15, 16, the next would be 17, 18, 19, 20. You would hold down Command, Option, and Shift and do the same function. So key commands like that really speed up your workflow. All right, great. So now I've got these three masters here. I'm going to color code them all the same color. And then I've got, now maybe I would like to, I don't like the order that I'm doing this, so I'm going to take these and move these. I'm going to have these master tracks be at the bottom, and these next tracks are going to be my effects. So I'm going to have a reverb, and I'm going to have a delay. Okay, and then I'm not sure what this one's going to be. I'll have this, keep that in abeyance for right now, and if I need to use it, I will. And I'll make sure these are all the same color. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert a reverb track, a reverb plugin. So I go to my insert column, and I go to reverb, and I'm just going to, I have lots of reverbs. I mean, it's really disturbing how many plugins I own. But what ends up happening is, you know, as I do a job, I pick up something, and over the course of 10 years, you end up with a lot, or 15 or 20 years, you end up with a lot of stuff. But I'm just going to use very simple, basic stuff. And I'll use the deverb, which is not a great reverb, but it is what it is. And then I'm going to go here to the delay, and I'll put in the mod delay 3. And these are the very stock basic things in Pro Tools. Now, what I will say about Pro Tools is if you've got it recently, the free version that they were giving to students for 90 days, you will actually have better plugins. You will have access to all of these plugins here, and there's some pretty good ones. Space is a good reverb. Revibe is a good reverb. So you can try those if you want. And I'm just going to leave this one blank for now. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to send all of my outputs to the input of the music track. And I'll tell you why in a second. So I've selected those, and I'm holding down Option and Shift, and I'm sending it to the music track. And then the piano also needs to go to the music track. Oh, it is. It's already going to the music track. Great. Now, why is that? I can mute everything there. Let's say I'm doing a film and I've got a dialogue track. I can use this as like a one fader control to make sure that the music is not overpowering the dialogue. Okay, I'm going to save. Correct. And it's also solo saved. Right? There's no, see the solo is grayed out. Right. So, yeah. So you would use the send. I think that, right. So in other words, if I want a piano reverb, so let me. That's fine. So let me solo the piano, and notice the reverb soloed, so you'll hear it. So if I go here to my sends, and I select, oh, I didn't set the inputs yet. Whoops. Okay. So input. And then rename that reverb. And then we need to have our input for our delay. So I just have the piano track going. Add my reverb. Turn the volume of this up. Now that reverb's not right for this track, but that's how you would set it up. Now, before you start doing fancy things like reverbs, you have to do some gain staging. This is the last bit that we're going to do today. Now, I'll send out a link. But I went and downloaded a bunch of metering plugins that are free. So I'll send you a link and you download the one that works with your software. So if you've got Pro Tools, right, you would do the AAX. If you've got it in a PC, you would do it with the .exe. If you've got Logic, you would do it with the audio units, although Logic might have a metering plugin. And if you've got Cubase or Ableton, I believe you would use VST. And if you've got Reaper, I think that's VST as well. So this guy right here in Pro Tools is the meter of your main output. It's very, very tiny. It's really hard to see. So there's two things. Let me just show you something on my desk here. I'm going to pick up the webcam for a second. But on my desk, whoops, right here, I've got a meter, right? It's pretty big. And I insert a plug-in into my music track, and I can see all my levels and my overall frequencies in that 1 meter, and it's really big and it's always there. But what you can do is you can insert into the music track something that's metering, right? That you can see the level of everything. So you can leave this open, and in Pro Tools, if you want to leave this open, you can hit this red button here, the target mode, and turn that off, and then that'll stay open. So I want to take a listen to the drums and see what the level is. And I'm going to go to find where the loudest area is. This looks pretty loud here. And I'm going to look at two things. I'm going to look at the level of the individual tracks, and I'm going to look at the level of the aggregate. So the individual tracks levels are in this metering here. Now, you see during that fill right here, that snare drum thing almost overdrove. It almost distorted, went too loud. You could see that the amber, I don't know if you could see it on your screens, but the amber, which is the peak, is almost at the very top. You could see it up here, but see how tiny that is? If we look on the larger meter, right, that gets up to almost 12. That's way too loud. So there are two ways to turn down the volume of a track. One is to turn the fader down, like this, but the other consideration is to do with signal flow. The output of this track is going to the input of let me just do this. This will be a little bit easier to explain. This is the overhead. The output of this track is going to the input of this track and traveling through here. If this signal is too loud here, even if you turn the volume down here, it doesn't change the volume of the sound that's going in. It only changes the volume of what's coming out. And if what's coming in is too loud, it will overload the plugins that you put in here. So you have to be careful of the level that's going in and the level that's coming out. So this is not bad. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit, but let me just, I did something really stupid there. In order to have the volume of the track be a little bit softer before it goes in to the signal chain or the signal path, you could bring down the clip gain here. So I'm just going to bring that down a few dB. Right? And let me check this out now. All right, so this is fine. This might be something that I do a volume ride on a little bit later. And then now I'm going to listen to, I'm going to mute the snare drum and kick drum. And the point here is that you want most of the sound for your drums to be the sound of the overhead, and you want the kick and the snare to be the definition. So you're not going to hear this so great over the stream that we have now, but hopefully if you watch the YouTube video, it'll have a better it has better audio quality, and I'll definitely send out the link for that. Right, you can hear how much louder the kick drum is now. You want to have it loud enough so that it just adds a little bit of definition, but doesn't overtake the sound of the overheads. And the same with the snare. Now, there are many, like as far as the metering thing goes, there are other ones that you can download that you might like. There's this one here that's also part of that package. This is a little bit easier to see maybe. So for me, that's looking pretty good. You know, nothing's getting up into the red and nothing's getting up too high. It's all at about, the peaks are about -5, -4, somewhere around there. But it's all living here. And why that's okay, and we may bring that up later, why that's okay for now is you got to realize that we're going to be adding all these other tracks in, and we're going to be bringing all those levels are going to be summing together. So I'm just going to leave the drums there for now. All right. And one other thing, as a general rule, I don't bring the volume above 0. If you have to bring the volume of anything above 0, then something else is too loud. It needs to come down. That's just a general rule. So now let's add our bass in. And we'll just solo our bass VCA. Okay. So we've got 3 tracks of bass. We've got a TLM. These are 2 Neumann mics, a TLM 103, which is a large capsule condenser microphone. And that's down by the bridge and the sound hole, getting the body of the bass. And then the K184 is a small capsule condenser microphone. And I will go over what the difference between the microphones are at some point. This is up on the fingerboard. And you can hear it's thinner and snappier. And then the direct, this is the pickup from the bass. And that's a lot of mid-range. And what you want to do is, it's your taste how you blend these 3 tracks together. So what I like to do is to think about how it fits in the track. If this was a dense track, I might have more of the fingerboard in than the TLM 103, which is down by the body. So it's snappier and cuts through the track more. But there's not a lot of low-end information on this track that you have to worry about. So I think I'm going to make this sound be mostly the TLM 103. And you could see here that that's way too loud, even without that meter being open. You see how it's up in the red? So that's before it gets into the signal path. So I want to bring the clip gain down on that quite a bit. So I'm going to come down about 9 dB. Right, that might be a little bit too much. And then I'm going to balance out. So I'm listening to that. The bass overall might be just a tad too loud still. So I'm just going to bring the VCA. I'm going to employ that to bring the faders down because I've got a nice setup here with all the clip gain before it goes into the faders. So, okay. So I think I could go on with this. I think we'll pick up with this next week at this point. Do as much of this as you can over the next week. Any questions on this? Yes, and I try not to have any fader be above 0. That's just my own personal thing. Yeah, if you do good gain staging, you most likely won't need to. But look, there are engineers that don't give a crap about that and they put it above 0. They're better engineers than I am. You know, I'm a composer who knows how to engineer, right? So that's just sort of a habit that I want my students to get into, is that if you have to turn a fader up so loud to hear it that it's above 0, then there are other issues most likely with your mix. And I want you to focus on getting those things better. All right? Right. So right. So that's just the way that Logic does that. The way Pro Tools handles it is different, right? So, but the end result is that you do the same thing with it, right? So there's no look. My take on this is that there are things that Logic does incredibly well, and there are things that Pro Tools does incredibly well. There's things that Cubase does incredibly well. There's things that Ableton does. All these softwares, there's no best or good or bad. There's only what works for you. The reason I use Pro Tools is because I started out with this software called Vision, which then became Studio Vision, which was incredible. I actually started out with little hardware sequencers in the 80s, but my first computer sequencer was something called Vision, and it got bought by Gibson as a tax write-off, and they tanked the software, and the last version of Vision came out in like 1999. And then when Apple switched to OS 10 around 2000, I hung out with Vision for 4 years. But at some point, I needed to get a new computer which had OS 10, and I couldn't use Vision in OS 10 because it used something called OMS, which was invented. It was a way that the computer talked to external MIDI instruments. And it was invented by this guy named Doug Wyatt, who now works for Apple. He's a friend of mine. But I knew how to use Pro Tools a little bit at that point. And at that point, Pro Tools 6.4 came out with much better MIDI. Not great MIDI, but much better MIDI. And I didn't have time to learn Logic. I was so busy working on projects, writing projects, that I didn't have time to learn a new piece of software. So I'm still using Pro Tools, and I don't have any problems with it. And there were really well-known Hollywood composers, which is, films is my focus, films and television music, that compose in Logic. And there are some that also compose in Pro Tools. But at the end of the day, almost everything that I do ends up in Pro Tools for the final mix down, because everything in film and television is mixed in Pro Tools at the end of the day. All the music and dialogue, Foley, sound effects, and everything. So do as much of up to this point as you can over the next week. Come in with questions, and we'll just continue on. So next week we'll work on balancing off the brass. Then we'll start adding some reverb and delay, and then I'll get into adding some EQ. But the important things to understand is signal flow and gain staging, groups, organizing your session, color coding, aux tracks, VCA masters. Do as much of that stuff as your software will allow you to do, because I could get perfectly good mixes before I used VCA masters, but now I can't. It's hard for me to work without them. But they really are very helpful. Okay, so any last questions? Let me see if there's any typed questions that I missed. Yes, sir. You can watch this video. If I get time over the next week, I'll make a list. But you can watch the YouTube recap of this. It's still streaming, so hopefully it all came out well. And that definitely, I tested it out with Dr. Smaldone earlier this week, and it seemed to work pretty much better audio-wise. But it's harder to have back and forth conversation in YouTube because there's about a 10 or 15 second lag. So if you type in a question on YouTube, it takes me 10 or 15 seconds to see it. So it's not I don't have the visual feedback. All right. So thank you everyone for showing up for this. I'm happy to do this, to share all this knowledge, and hopefully, over the course of the next six or 7, 8 weeks, however long we do this, you guys will gain some knowledge that'll help you out. And I learn too from teaching this stuff. I have to get stuff together so I know what I'm talking about. All right.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Have a great week, everyone, and stay safe. Oh, yeah, sure, Ed. Nice to see you again. All right. I'm ending my YouTube stream.